Shadow of the Erdtree introduced an entirely new region and history to the lore of Elden Ring, a realm that served as a nexus for death and is overshadowed by the shadow of the Erdtree. However, the cosmic elements of the lands of Shadow were anchored by the people who called these lands home, the Hornsent. The Hornsent are a Crucible era culture that would eventually be set aflame by Messmer's crusade. But this is only the tail end of their story, as the Hornsent culture is a rich one, a people with their own beliefs, religion and practices that developed independent from the Erdtree, and this is something really unique in the world of Elden Ring. The Hornsent are a worthy study in of themselves, but they also offer a new avenue to explore the lore of the Crucible and the early history of Queen Marika. Perhaps most importantly, they reinforce the tragic notion of cycles that exist within Elden Ring's story. Marika's order would replace that of the Hornsent, and whilst we know the Golden Order for its cruelty, perhaps those that came before were no better. So join me this week as we unpack the Hornsent, their rich culture, the challenges they faced, their history, and the cruelty that they inflicted. But before we get started, remember that if you like Elden Ring lore, then consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. But before we uncover the secrets of the Hornsent civilization, it is time for a word from today's sponsor, Factor. Factor is a convenient meal service for busy Tarnish that takes the stress out of meal planning by delivering chef-crafted meals straight to your door. With over 35 meals to choose from per week, including keto, calorie smart and vegetarian options. The range even extends to snack options, breakfast, smoothies, juices and more to keep you going as you attempt Radahn for the 300th time. As a man living in Scotland, we don't have this, but I believe it might be summer where you are, and so for those who want to spend more time outside, Factor can help you do that by getting chef prepared meals on the table in just 2 minutes. For me, it gives me more precious time in the lands of Shadow, my true summer happy place. For those interested, Factor are offering SmoughTown viewers a great deal. Get 50% off your first Factor box and 20% off your next month of orders using my link. Click the link in the description or scan the QR code with your phone. Thanks again to Factor for sponsoring this video, and now back to the lore. I think a good starting point when looking at the lore of the Hornsent is to establish their relationship to the Crucible, as it is central to their identity, religions and culture. Bellerat lies in the region that we now know as the Lands of Shadow, and these lands once had a strong relationship with the Crucible. We know this thanks to the description of the aspect of the Crucible bloom, which reads the following: aspect of the Crucible discovered in the ancient ruins. In an age long past before this land was enshrouded in shadow, the vitality of the Crucible flourished. The influence of the Crucible in the lands between is often indicated by the presence of horns, like we see in the case of the Omen or the Misbegotten. Thus it is no surprise that horns are very prevalent in the Land of Shadows. The Beast Horn item description reads the following: the Crucible has a particularly strong influence on the beasts of the Realm of Shadow, causing many to grow horns, despite the characteristics of their species. Indeed, we see this all throughout the DLC. For example, a number of animals have horns, tortoise and the red bears. And of course, there are the humanoid people of these lands who have horns, the Hornsent. There aren't many living Hornsent left, but those we do meet all have horns, like Empyrean Grandam, Miquella's Hornsent, and the other greater potentates. They all have omen-like horns. Additionally, and this is a great detail, if you look at the ghosts and spirits found in these lands, you will note that they also have horns, leaving us in no doubt that this was a horned race that was affected by the power of the Crucible. Thus my conclusion is that while the powers of the Crucible may still affect people everywhere, including in the lands between, its power was once centred in the Lands of Shadow. Another piece of evidence that reinforces this is Crucible Knight Devonia's presence here, who is found in the ancient ruins of Ra, and her helmet tells us why she is here. It reads the following: helm worn by Devonia, longest serving of the Crucible Knights. It is said Devonia quested in search of the Crucible's origin, and departed the lands of the Erdtree alone. Devonia has come to these lands specifically to find clues of the Crucible's origins, and when taken in tandem with sources like Bloom and Beast Horn, it leaves us in little doubt that this land was once where the Crucible's power was focused. A couple of things I'd like to touch on here before we move on, in regards to the age of the Crucible itself, something I've touched on in other videos, but I think it's particularly relevant here, so I'd like to discuss it. In older videos, I had believed that the age of the Crucible was simply an immediate precursor to the Erdtree, the ancient Erdtree era, that overlapped with the Age of Plenty. However, even just prior to the DLC, when I did my story summary video, I was beginning to question this narrative, and in that video, having reassessed the evidence and the language used, I suggested that the Crucible was in fact an ancient force that has existed since the beginning of life. With the arrival of the DLC, I think we can retextualize a lot of evidence found in the base game, and paint a more accurate picture of the Crucible's placement in Elden Ring's greater timeline. To start, both the Crucible talismans and the Bloom incantation that we just looked at imply that the Crucible is ancient, primordial even. These are very specific terms, with primordial actually meaning existing from the beginning of time. We also have 3 named Crucible Knights associated with the Crucible, of course, that are named after a specific period of the Paleozoic era: Devonia, Siluria, and Ordovis. All signs pointing towards the Crucible being the source of primordial life existing from the beginning of Elden Ring's timeline, and this is why it's often associated with the word ancient. That is to say that the Crucible has been around for a long time, and it isn't just a precursor stage to the Erdtree, stretching as far back at least to the time of the ancient civilization of Ra, given this is where Devonia has actually come to search for the origins of the Crucible, and it's where we find the incantation Bloom, which mentions the ancient civilization in its item description. Ultimately, I believe that the arrival of the Elden Ring in the lands between was the instigating event that led to the division of the One Great and the emergence of the Crucible. Additionally, if the Crucible is associated with ancient civilizations, there are a couple of other ancient civilizations that are mentioned in Elden Ring as well. First being the ancient civilization of Ul and Ur palaces, which is referred to as the Ancient Dynasty in the description of Oracle Bubbles. I would therefore suggest that the tree shown on Elden John's tablet is likely a depiction of the Crucible, as the Crucible is often interpreted as a tree, and prior to the Erdtree, it was clearly the source of life and power in the world of Elden Ring, and thus will likely have been the locus of worship in the era before the age of the Erdtree. There is another ancient civilization, of course, that of the Ancient Dragons. If we consider the civilization of Farum Azula to be part of this ancient era, then it tracks that the Crucible will have been a factor in this time as well. We know from Placidusax's remembrance that he was Elden Lord in the time before the Erdtree, and indeed I now believe that the Crucible was also the focal point during Placidusax's reign. I have often referred to the depiction of the Elden Ring that is found in Farum Azula, and how it's clearly different from the configuration of the stripped-back and orderly Elden Ring of the Golden Order. Clearly this is an Elden Ring for a more bestial and primal era, ruled over by the dragons and inhabited by beastmen. However, with everything we have discussed so far, I now believe that the branching pattern shown on this Elden Ring is connected to the Crucible in some way, and it's not a new theory, of course, other people have suggested this, but it's one that is seeming more and more likely to me. As we will discuss shortly, I think it's quite clear that the Crucible is a force generated by the Elden Ring or influenced by the Greater Will, and in past videos I have often argued that the ancient dragons and their civilization are likely the first civilization of this world, following the division of the One Great. Consider the fact that the Greater Will never acts directly, usually acting through an intermediary or a vassal. Examples of this include the Elden Beast, the Two Fingers, and of course Marika herself, the earthly representative of the Greater Will, and vessel for its Elden Ring. To me, it is clear that the Elden Ring is the artifact through which the Greater Will can remotely impose its will, how it imposes order and structure in the lands between. We know that it was the Greater Will who was responsible for dividing the One Great, the former form of life, thanks to the dialogue that we receive via Hyeta, when she is under the influence of the Three Fingers, as after we touch her when we become the Lord of Chaos, she receives a vision from them, and she says the following.
All that there is came from the One Great. Then came fractures, and births, and souls. But the Greater Will made a mistake. Torment, despair, affliction, every sin, every curse, every one born of the mistake.
If the One Great was divided by the Greater Will, then it has to have done it remotely. And the Elden Ring is a powerful artifact which imposes the rules of the universe. It structures things and imposes its order. And to me, this event coincides nicely with the events that are described in Elden Stars, where the Elden Ring is said to have come on a star to the lands between. And to me, upon its arrival, it caused the division of the One Great, and thus brought about diverse life. Now, it is my belief that the Crucible came into existence at this time, and has existed from the very beginning of diverse life. The aspect of the Crucible incantations, the various forms that we get, all read the following. This is a manifestation of the Erdtree's primal vital energies, an aspect of the primordial Crucible where all life was once blended together. It is a primordial source in which all life was blended together. Putting two and two together, I believe that following the One Great, the Crucible was brought into existence by the Elden Ring, and from it, evolution happened. I recently did a podcast with Radataskor, who made some really interesting observations regarding the Crucible. To Radataskor, the Crucible is an analogy for evolution, and throughout this video we will discuss how accurate that observation really is. From its double helix form to the symbols of evolution found in creatures associated with the Crucible. All signs point to the fact that the Crucible is the driving force of evolution in this world, and it was only at the time of the Erdtree that evolution stopped and life was more ordered, conformed. But I've touched on that many times in other videos. For now, let's stay focused on the Crucible. And with that said, and my thoughts on the Crucible's place on the timeline now complete, I want to talk about the Hornsent's relationship to the Crucible. We've already discussed the fact that the influence of the Crucible is stronger in these lands, even more so than anywhere else in the age of the Crucible. And to me, it suggests that not every civilization would have been affected by its power nearly as much, and that there would have been humanoids that didn't have horns, i.e. the draconian race of the ancient dragons, or Marika's shaman people, of which we see no evidence of them having horns. However, the Hornsent are particularly affected by its power, as illustrated by their horns, further proof of their proximity and relationship to its power. Unlike in the time of the Erdtree, the signifiers and elements of the Crucible were once considered divine, and this was something we did learn in the base game via the Crucible Knot, Scale and Feather talismans, and these read the following. A vestige of the Crucible of primordial life. Born partially of devolution, it was considered a signifier of the divine in ancient times, but is now increasingly disdained as an impurity as civilization has advanced. And so, as you would expect of the Hornsent, a civilization based around the veneration of such assets, we have a contrasting set of talismans now found in the DLC, the Tanglehorn talismans. For example, we have the Mottled Necklace, which reads the following. Horns are sublime artifacts to the Hornsent, and their presence confirms the belief that they are a chosen people. Only the repeated sprouting of fresh horns can create a tangled horn, which is viewed as an irrefutable symbol of primacy. As we'll discuss throughout this chapter, the Hornsent interpret the Crucible as a divine god from on high, a horn-decked beast, and thus the Hornsent have the horns sent from the divine above, hence their name. To them, having horns on your body isn't a result of having proximity to the Crucible, a scientific thing. In fact, it's a gift from above, a god sharing its elements with its chosen people. To the Hornsent, there is no higher honour than having these horns, and among horns, tangle horns are the most honoured. The talisman we just looked at seems to point to an advanced growth of horns, a phenomenon known as the tangle horns, that are the result of repeated sprouting of horns that causes them to overlap and create a sort of layer almost. So valued are horns in this society that more equals better. Just as an aside, we can get further evidence of how valuable horns are to their society by looking at their currency, the horn tender with both gold and silver varieties being made by coating horns in gold or silver respectively. This in turn can tell us something about the social structure of Hornsent society, with those of means being those who are in possession of more horns, whether currency or natural. A really interesting observation was made by fellow content creator Dom's Roundtable, who highlighted the fact that the silver horn tender can be farmed from Hornsent ghosts that are found in Ballarat or in the towns, but cannot be farmed by those found out in the lands, suggesting that those in the city are those of means and a higher social standing, given the silver horn tender states they are symbolic of the upper echelons of society. In turn, the gold horn tender is bestowed upon inquisitors as an honour, thus signifying how important this institution, the Inquisition, is to Ballarat society, but more on them later. But in short, the Hornsent worship a crucible in analogous forms, horned forms, and thus it would be great having elements of your god upon your body. It's a divine thing. Thus it's no surprise that statues would be carved to memorialise special tangle horn births, as we learn via the horned bairn item, which reads the following. Tangled horns are a symbol of spirituality, but most young-born bearing these oversized horns meet a frightfully early demise. These fetishes are made to memorialise them. Tangle horns are celebrated, even in their deaths, and perhaps this explains the prominence of Empyrean Grandam, the character we meet in Ballarat, as she does seem to bear tangle horn upon her brow, and yet she has lived to an old age. All of this to say that the Hornsent view the Crucible as divine, as a god, and the way in which they interpret the divine is extremely interesting, and as I suggested, it explains why they venerate horns so highly. For many players, the first introduction they will get to the Hornsent's belief system is via the divine beast Dancing Lion, when Empyrean Grandam recites a prayer in order to animate this warrior.
O horn-decked beast from higher sphere delivered, take root inside the tower's sculpted keepers, and perched within, we beg of thee, rise. Dance and kavod, cleanse all and wood, cruelty, woe, and those who plague the tower. Cleanse away the strumpet's vile.
Here we get a lot of interesting pieces of lore, but I want to focus on this interpretation of the divine as a horned beast from a higher sphere. This is interesting to me because when you examine the lore surrounding the Hornsent's belief system, you will see that they often associate the divinity with the sky. This includes their interpretation of the Crucible itself, which they see as a spiral. A good place to start when understanding this phenomena is by looking at the item description of the incantation Spira, which reads the following. Superior sorcery of the Tower Priests, wielded as an incantation of the spiral. Wrap one's arms together and hold them up to the heavens to summon a spiral of light. The spiral is a normalized crucible current that one day will form a column that stretches to the gods. So here we can see that the Hornsent were able to manifest the Crucible's power as a spiral shape, and this is why the spiral is so important to the Hornsent people. A nice detail that I enjoy is that if you look at the Hornsent spell sigil, you will see that it depicts a spiral tree that is adorned with some horns, wrapping around a pair of arms that reach upwards to the heavens. A nice holistic encapsulation of their beliefs, and further examples of their veneration of the spiral shape can be found elsewhere. The spiral tree seal reads the following: Sacred seal of soiled amber, engraved with a spiral tree design, the majesty of the White Tower, stretching to reach the gods, even inspired a secret faith in the invaders, the people of the Erdtree. Thus the spiral is reflected everywhere. They depict the Crucible as a spiral tree. They have spiral candles, spiral pillars. There are spirals everywhere, in Belorat and in Elim if you look carefully. And as the spiral tree seal itself says, even Elim was designed in the shape of a spiral to emulate the Crucible current. And with this new information from the DLC, I see the Crucible as something largely intangible, a current of energy that can be manifested as a spiral. It is something esoteric that is hard for humanity to understand, which is why the Hornsent interpret it as a spiral tree. It's easier to understand that way. Going back to Radataskor's point about the Crucible being the force of evolution, perhaps it's also relevant that the Crucible takes the form of a spiral helix, much like DNA, and this was something I completely missed in my story summary video, so thank you to everyone in the comments who pointed this out. Credit to you all. The spiral power emitted by this incantation is a current drawn from the Crucible itself, and indeed, looking back at some of the evidence in the base game relating to the Crucible, we can see this idea was clearly present even there, it's just that no one really picked up on it. For example, the tabard of the Crucible Knights also depicts a spiral shape, and when I was making this observation in my story summary video, something quite funny actually happened. I showed a Siluria Crucible Knight in a pose, so I could highlight this tabard. However, as many viewers pointed out, this Crucible Knight is also using the weapon art for the Siluria Spear, which also manifests as a spiral, something I didn't notice, so again, shout out to everyone who pointed this out to me, as this was an observation I completely missed. But yeah, the point being is that Spira isn't the first incantation where the Crucible manifests as a spiral. The Siluria Spear weapon art also manifests as a spiral. But the fact that the Crucible is likely something intangible and is just a force explains why there are so many different depictions and interpretations of the Crucible. It clearly means different things to different people. For example, both the Hornsent and the Crucible Knights see it as a tree, but completely different trees. To the Hornsent, it's a spiral tree that reaches up to the heavens, and yet this doesn't match up to what we see in Siluria's set. Siluria's helm and spear, according to their item descriptions, also are depicting the Crucible, but this shape of a tree is very different. It is more wild and chaotic. But to me, they're just interpretations of the same power. To the Hornsent, it's a graceful current that can be traced upwards to the heavens. To the Crucible Knights, it's a source of chaotic power, hence why their tree depictions are very different. The spiral shape, however, is only one part of the Hornsent's understanding of the Crucible's power, as I alluded to before. The other is something that is hinted at in Grandam's speech, that the Hornsent also see the Crucible and its powers as a sort of god, a god that exists in a higher sphere, and this is why the currents of the Crucible are so important to them, because they reach up to the domain of the gods in the sky. Thus, it's not a surprise that a lot of the Hornsent's beliefs are connected to the sky and the heavens. Elim itself is a spiral that reaches far into the sky, and is clearly meant to give the Hornsent access to this higher sphere of existence, to their heaven. And ultimately there is clearly some validity to their beliefs and reading of things, as sitting atop Elim is the gate of divinity, a nexus of power that affords beings the ability to ascend to godhood. Both Marika and Mikola are proof of its very real power. My interpretation of this is that the Hornsent are correct in tracing the Crucible currents to the heavens, to the sky, and by building a tower that mimicked and followed this flow upwards, they located a coalescence of crucible energy in the sky, the location that is now the Gate of Divinity. If this is a node of heavy crucible energies, a force of transformation that is tied to the Elden Ring, then it should be no surprise that it allows someone to become a god, as stepping into this nexus of crucible energy would have huge transformative powers. Additionally, there's the matter of the bodies that are found around the Gate of Divinity, these corpses all merged together. In line with my current theory about the gate, I believe that these bodies have been pulled together by the power of the Crucible. Remember, the Crucible is a force in which life was once all blended together, and thus I see this collection of melded flesh as a consequence of this well of Crucible power which it surrounds. I think one thing that we can be almost certain about is that the Hornsent will have had their own mortal god and order. They owned the Gate of Divinity, and so it follows that they once had someone step through it to claim godhood. A Hornsent god who held the position that Marika now does. And I think in a lot of ways the upper levels of Anir Elim look like a royal court, like the arena where we fight Leda, a large circular chamber with monks sitting around the side. Perhaps this was their king's audience chamber, but either way I think it's pretty safe speculation to assume that the Hornsent once had their own god, and were perhaps the prior custodians of the Elden Ring, like Marika is now. As such, I've always assumed that the scene of Queen Marika that we see in the story trailer for the DLC is her seducing and killing the Hornsent god, and taking their power for herself. Ultimately, the Gate of Divinity is a powerful artifact, and no doubt the Hornsent benefited from its application. No doubt this will have blended with their understanding of divinity, that they had a god from among themselves who was granted this position and power by their god on high, given the Gate of Divinity sits in the heavens. So now we understand why the Hornsent associate divinity with the sky. As such, the predecessors to the Horned Warriors, the Divine Bird Warriors, interpreted God as a bird. We learn of these warriors via the ashes of the Divine Bird Warrior Ornis, which reads the following: Spirit of the Divine Bird Warrior from which the Horned Warriors claimed descent, clad in golden armour and granted wings and feathers by divine invocation. Ornis succeeded in taming the divine bird and made its wings his own. As he soared through the sky, when he finally fell to earth, he lived on as a guardian deity of the temple quarter. The first thing I want to comment on is the fact that these are golden divine bird warriors. Of course, as I've suggested already, the Crucible is clearly, to me anyway, tied to the power of the Elden Ring, and this is why gold is often associated with the Crucible as well, not just the Erdtree. For example, we also see that the Crucible Knights have a red gold armour, and so it's interesting to see that the Divine Bird Warriors also associates the Crucible with gold. And I see this Divine Bird religion as the earliest way in which the Hornsent would view the Crucible, and it's easy to understand why they might interpret it as a divine bird. First of all, as we've discussed ad nauseum, its power is located within the sky, but more importantly, all warriors associated with the Crucible quite often manifest its power as wings. We see this in the Black Knights, the Crucible Knights, and of course these Divine Bird Warriors. And thus if they call upon the Crucible's power, and it manifests in this bird way, they might well see it as a divine bird. And so when Ornis's Ash talks of him taming this divine bird, I take it to mean he mastered the powers of the Crucible, being able to manifest it in the form of wings and feathers. Divine Bird Feathers, an incantation used by these warriors, reads the following: A technique of the Divine Bird Warriors, the very first of all horned warriors, wielded as an incantation. The Divine Bird Warriors, and indeed this technique, are said to bear resemblance to the Golden Crucible, thus reinforcing the fact that this divine bird is just another interpretation of the Crucible and its powers. But the interpretation of their god as a horn-decked beast is clearly a more sophisticated evolution of these rudimentary beliefs. There are a couple of similarities, mainly that this beast, this god, still lives in the heavens, the higher sphere from above, as mentioned by Grandham's speech. But of course, intimately tied to this god is the divine beast Lion Dancer, and the form of these constructions are in general an excellent representation of the Crucible era as a whole. Its lion-esque form reminds us of Sirosh, who was once the Lord of Beasts in an age prior to the Erdtree, and in general I associate beasts and wild violence with the Crucible. Additionally, it is of course covered in horns that are indicative of the Crucible's presence. The Divine Beast Dancers clearly hold a position of great importance within Hornsent society, as the enraged Divine Beast talisman reads the following: Divine Beasts are messengers of the heavens, and their rage mirrors the tumult of the skies, of which storms are the pinnacle. Again, reinforcing the fact that their god is one of the skies and the storms, and it reveals why the Divine Beast and Horned Warriors practice storm manipulation incantations. Again, they relate the divine with the sky, and thus these holy warriors wield the power of the storms in the name of their god. We know that the Divine Beast Dancers start their life as Horned Warriors, who slowly progress towards Dancer status as their mastery over storm calling increases, and this makes them suitable to become messengers in time. The Divine Beast armour set reads the following: Armour of fated Horned Warriors chosen to become Divine Beast Warriors, adorned with a lion's pelt. Among the Divine Beast Warriors, only those who truly excel at divine invocation become sculpted keepers, and are granted the honour of the lion dance. Thus, only the most skilled among the Horned Knights become Divine Beast Warriors, and then the most skilled among the Divine Beast Warriors are allowed to become a Lion Dancer. This makes sense, as the Lion Dancer seems to be made of two individuals, both of which seem to be extremely skilled in all variants of Divine Storm invocation: lightning, storm, and ice. The Hornsent believe these warriors to be the messengers to the gods, and thus we can only imagine the prominent position that these beings held in their society. Though Grandham's dialogue following us taking on the disguise of a lion dancer gives us some hint, as she is absolutely delighted that she's finally meeting a sculpted keeper after so long.
Does a sculpted keeper stand before me? Oh! As I felt the sacred beast's essence fade, a great anxiety welled up within. Forgive this old woman her foolish fears. 'Tis such relief I cannot express. After an eternity of the mind, our voices have at last reached the heavens.
The Lyre Dancer's remembrance tells us that while they were eventually used in the war against Messmer as weapons of war, they were primarily used in ritual. The Horned Warriors' martial prowess was in preparation for communication, rather than any military considerations. These combat techniques are a ritual dance, and graduating to the Lion Dance is the highest honour, as they believe these masters of the dance and invocation are actually messengers to the god. Their aesthetic form is of great importance to the Hornsent, as we do see these lions celebrated in statues and fountains and other decorations around and near a limb. Perhaps the form of the lion dancer is chosen to reflect their god, and they truly believe that the horn-decked beast from the higher sphere, their god, is this sort of horned lion, and thus the Horned Warriors and Divine Beast Dancers seek to emulate it. And this in turn tells us something about the Horned Warriors. Yes, they were soldiers, but in a lot of ways what they were training to do was less about martial prowess, though that was a nice benefit. It was about communing with their brutal and powerful god. They too had to become wielders of the storm. And so now we have a decent understanding of their belief system. It all stems from the Crucible and how they interpret it and interact with it. To the Hornsent, the Crucible currents being traced to the heavens is proof of a divine being existing on a higher sphere. I think one of the main takeaways from this section should be how important religion is to the Hornsent. It is the centre pillar of their entire society. Their capital, Belurat, is built around their divine tower near a limb, which reaches up to the heaven. In addition to Belurat, they have the Temple Quarter, another centre of Hornsent religion. Their warrior caste are religious warriors, with their technique, arms and methods being directly inspired by their gods and seen as a method to commune with them, whether it was with the horn-decked beast or the divine bird before it. We also have to consider the prominence of inquisitors within their society. We will talk about them shortly, but a lot of resources and importance is put into this movement, a movement that is primarily interested in stamping out heterodox religions and upholding the state. With that said, let us now talk about some of the cults and minority beliefs that did exist in Hornsent culture, and how the Hornsent brutally dealt with such cult beliefs. The first sub-belief that I want to look at is the one of the Hornsent aesthetics, aka the Curseblades, and these are the extremely difficult enemies that you are likely to face when you're in Gravesite Plains. We do learn a little bit about these unusual beings via their loincloth, which reads the following. In order to ascend from their mortal flesh into tutelary deities of the land, they heighten their spirituality through severe ascetic training. Additionally, we learn from their masks that this is a crown of tangled horns, meant to invoke divinity. This tells us that these monks still believe in the divinity of horns, but they aspire to become tutelary deities of these lands in their own right, by following a path of asceticism. For those unaware, asceticism is a particular way of living your life that is often associated with monks. It is a life of self-discipline where you dedicate your entire life to a particular belief system and avoid worldly pleasures and indulgence. Thus, the Curseblades are essentially an order of monks who live their life via extreme tenets in order to become tutelary deities. But what does this mean when they want to become gods? Well, I do not believe they actually want to become proper gods. Rather, I believe they want to become something akin to a Buddha in the real world. If we carry on with the monk analogy, Buddhist monks also follow a life of asceticism, following the original teachings of Buddha, using his life as an instructive manual as to how to live theirs. To Buddhists, following your life in this way is a way in which you can achieve enlightenment. Now, Buddha isn't strictly viewed as a god by most Buddhists, but is instead revered for paving the way, for teaching people how to live their life and how to reach a state of enlightenment. He acts as a guide for all Buddhists, i.e., he is a tutelary figure. This is how I see these Curseblades. They are Hornsent who follow a specific set of strict rules in order to attain a certain level of perceived enlightenment, so that they too can act as an instruction for others to live their lives. This is also not the only time that we hear the term tutelary deity, as it's actually used in relation to revered Spirit Ash, which reads the following. Spirit Ash of those who came before, infused with potent spirituality, acquired from the corpses of Hornsent and other objects that ritually decorate townships and villages across the realm of shadow. The withered corpses were called tutelary deities, and revered Spirit Ash was said to quietly accumulate in the palms of their hands. The withered corpses mentioned here are of course those that we can find throughout the lands of shadow, often holding revered Spirit Ash in their hands. These withered corpses again remind me of Buddhism and the practice of Buddhist mummies. I am hesitant to show any examples of these in the video because of demonetization. However, if you want to Google it, you can see some examples of these. But these are essentially Buddhist monks who die while meditating and are preserved. One being Lang Fodeng, a Thai monk who died while meditating in 1973, and his body is still on display at a temple. And I think that these withered corpses found throughout Hornsent settlements are meant to emulate this. They have their legs crossed as if they too are meditating. So these Curseblades want to become something like this. However, as we will discuss shortly, I do not believe the Curseblades are actually these withered corpses, as these withered corpses seem to be an accepted part of the religion in Hornsent society, while the Curseblades are not. It's just that they emulate the example of these tutelary deities. In a way, this tells us about the Hornsent burial practices and how they honour the dead. Remember, the Hornsent civilization is one that predates the Erdtree, and thus Erdtree burial would not be a thing, and it seems likely that this is how the dead was honoured. And given the talk of ash, i.e. bodies that are burned, I cannot help but think of the death rites of the Deathbirds. Explosive Ghost Flame reads the following: "In the time when there was no Erdtree, death was burned in Ghost Flame. Deathbirds were the keepers of that fire." So given that the Deathbirds were the dominant funerary rite prior to the Erdtree, I do think it's quite likely that the Hornsent civilization did indeed use the death rites as part of their funerary practices. In consort with the fact that they honour the ashes of their dead, I think we are able to paint a picture of the funerary rites of the Hornsent. Their dead would be burned in the flames of the death rites, and then the ash would be given to these tutelary deities, their way of honouring the dead. There are some further contextual hints that could further confirm that the Hornsent's funerary rites did indeed involve the Deathbird death rites. One piece of ornamentation that is found around Anir Alim that caught my eye was this boat, that seems to show the dead being shepherded on a boat. Of course, this makes us think of the coffin barges of Carillion Coast, which have bull heads on their prow, much like the Hornsent depictions have goats. So while it's not an exact match, it is hard to ignore the similarities. If the Hornsent did have their own coffin barges, then it would almost certainly link them to the death rites, as we know the coffin barges found at Carillion Coast held the remains of those burned in Ghost Flame. We know from the congealed putrescence item description that this is the material that is contained within these coffin barges, and massive putrescence tells us that this liquid is the remains of those who were burned in the Ghost Flame, as it reads the following: "Sorcery originating from the putrid liquor of the stone coffins. In an age long past, death was burned by Ghost Flame. Even the remains of tainted flesh were given equal treatment in death." Of course, we don't know for certain. This is just my interpretation of the contextual evidence, but I do believe that the Hornsent had their own funerary practices that started with the Deathbirds, involved a boat, and ended in the hands of the tutelary deities. Now, despite the importance of these tutelary deities, it does seem as though the Curseblades were not universally loved in Hornsent society, suggesting that while they emulate these tutelary deities, the Curseblades have never actually achieved this status, and indeed the Curseblades are actually reviled by greater Hornsent society. We learned something of this via Curseblade Mira's ashes, which read the following: "These ascetics who failed to become tutelary deities were a scourge for those who attempted to invade the Hornsent homeland. Long ago, before the land was overshadowed by invasion, this scourge was shunned, and the Curseblades were imprisoned. It was during this confinement that Mira met Libereth, and upon her death, Libereth was plunged into a devastating darkness." So yeah, it seems as though this movement was shunned and actually imprisoned by Hornsent society, given we also find Libereth still within a jar jail. And to reinforce the fact that the tutelary deities that we actually do find in the Lands of Shadow were not part of this movement, one need only look at the Outer God Heirloom Talisman, which confirms that praying to one of these tutelary deities is an act of sanctity. The Curseblades wanted to become these tutelary deities, but they were not. Instead, they were an extreme sect that was seen as a scourge to Hornsent society, imprisoned within their jar jails. However, of course, during Messmer's invasion, this scourge became very useful, because these Curseblades are extremely dangerous in combat, as I'm sure most of you are aware. Now, there are a couple of reasons why they might have been imprisoned by Hornsent society. First of all, ultimately their sect is a failure. They practice these brutal aesthetic ways of living, and yet they have failed to become tutelary deities. Additionally, they are quite extreme in their methods. We do learn a little bit of their darker side via their blades, which read the following: "Long ago, this was employed by the ascetics who strove to become tutelary deities as a ritualistic object in their self-flagellating dances. Perhaps the violent nature of this self-flagellation led to these beings becoming reviled, and perhaps the Hornsent Society just didn't like a new religious movement that was armed and violent taking place within their lands, and as such they were named a scourge and imprisoned. However, the Curseblades weren't the only sect that were imprisoned in the Jar jails. There are also the Lamenters, which we find in another jail, and the Lamenter's mask reads the following. This transformation tallies with the state of a denizen of paradise, but the people of the tower denied it and hid it from the world. In their foolishness, they viewed true bliss with deep fear. So again, the Lamenters seem to be a sub-religion or cult that were imprisoned in the Jar jails by the tower. And whilst these are both very extreme cults, and no wonder they were imprisoned, we are starting to see a pattern here of Belurat being quite intolerant of different cults and belief, and that they would quickly imprison these different sects. Hornsent Society was a dogmatic one, and therefore it isn't a surprise that Inquisitors play a big role in their society. We can assume that the Inquisitors occupied a position of prominence within Hornsent Society because of a couple of item descriptions, such as the Inquisitor's Ashes, which reads the following. Inquisitions often perplex the minds of the uninitiated, and so seniority was viewed as an asset. Clearly the Inquisitors were viewed as great thinkers, whose investigations and judgments would likely be respected, if not understood. Then we of course have the Goldhorn Tender, which reads the following. Old currency used by Hornsent, made by coating spiral horns with gold, once bestowed upon Inquisitors as an honour. We discussed earlier the importance of horns, and these tenders, and how they signify one's position in society. Thus we can conclude that these Inquisitors were valued greatly in Belurat, given the silver one is said to be in the possession of the upper classes of Hornsent Society, and so if Inquisitors are getting gold ones, they must hold an even higher social status than even the upper classes of Belurat. And perhaps it's no surprise that Inquisitors hold a high position of respect within Belurat society, given all that we have discussed already about the importance of their dogma and the imprisonment of other cults. The main real-life example of an Inquisition is of course the Spanish Inquisition, which was a religious movement, and likewise I think it is safe to assume that the Hornsent Inquisition is meant to investigate and purge any heresies, like that of the Lamenters and the Curseblades. This in turn tells us how important the state religion was to the Hornsent, and that they would not allow anything that did not fit in with this belief system, or challenged it, and indeed would punish such instances harshly and brutally. Indeed, the weapon art for the Great Sword of Damnation, a warped version of the Inquisitor barb, comments on how like the Golden Order and the Hornsent were in the application of power. Additionally, we can look to the signature weapon of the Inquisitors, the barbed staff spear, as evidence of their brutal judgments, as its description reads the following. Great staff of Jory, Elder Inquisitor. The tip bristles with golden barb symbolic of the Inquisition's torture, allowing one to wield the staff as a great spear. The mention of the Great Sword of Damnation and Inquisitor Jory of course brings us to the most significant instance of the Inquisition's work that we can see, the censoring of Midra and his followers, and the cruel treatment they suffered at the hands of the Inquisition. The map for the Abyssal Wood names Midra as a sage. The use of this term sage has interesting connotations, and we see this word used in relation to Sage Gowry and the Sage set from the base game, the latter of which reads the following. Thick burgundy robe, attire of the wise sages who were deemed heretical. I feel like this definition of a sage can be somewhat applied to Midra as well, in that he is a man of learning and intelligence, but one that was deemed heretical. We can only speculate on what led Midra to the Frenzied Flame, but given the size of his library, I would guess that he was just a man of learning, and in the course of his studies, he would discover the path of the Lord of Chaos. Senior Inquisitor Jory himself serves as the first line of defense against any who would try to enter the frenzy-touched lands of the Abyssal Woods. The Inquisitors still patrol these lands, and they themselves are not immune to the Frenzied Flame, as those we face here are capable of unleashing the Frenzied Flame's power, emphasising that containment really is the only option here. The lands are so saturated by the Flame's power that it visibly manifests on every rock and tree. It is of course understandable that the authorities would want to contain this spread. We know from the base game how destructive and apocalyptic the Frenzied Flame can be. However, that still does not quite prepare us for the scene that awaits us at Midra's manse. Out in front of the manse we can see a line of executed bodies, with a piece of gold protruding from their neck, likely signifying the presence of a barbed staff spear within them. Inside, we have the ghosts of those who were slaughtered by Inquisitors, still wondering what justified such rough treatment, with the Inquisitors themselves still present here, no doubt a station from which there was no return. Given that they are now likely tainted by the flame, they have to remain here. Of course, at the top of the manse we have Midra himself, with a spear staff still painfully embedded in his body, and yet, unlike his servants, Midra has not been granted the mercy of an execution, and instead has been left to live through this eternal pain. We do have to wonder why this choice was made. Surely it would be safer and more efficient to just kill Midra. After all, Midra is still able to become the Lord of Frenzied Flame, and so a lot of ways the Inquisition seemingly failed. Perhaps cruelty was more important to the Inquisition, and that making an example of Midra took priority over more efficiently dealing with this. Or perhaps there's more than meets the eye here, and that the Inquisition couldn't kill Midra without unleashing the Frenzied Flame. After all, in the cinematic where Midra becomes the Lord of Frenzied Flame, he drags the barbed staff spear through his body, and seemingly decapitates himself in the process. Indeed, Midra's head seems to have once been an item that was cut from the game. So with that in mind, perhaps the Inquisitors knew that Midra would become the Lord of Frenzied Flame if they executed him like they did his followers, because the flame had taken root too strongly in him at this stage, and as such they just contained Midra and watched over him as he was punished by the staff spear. I will cover Midra and the Frenzied Flame more in a future video, and as such I will likely leave his story there for now. But the events at Midra's manse are a fascinating insight into how the Hornsent would deal with those who fell afoul of their dogma. Of course, we cannot talk about the brutality of the Hornsent without assessing the Jar jails and their treatment of the Shaman people. Our main source of information on the Jar jails comes from Bonny Village, where apparently these jars are prepared. The greater potentates still roam this village, and they wield instruments of their trade, the Bonny butchering knives, which read the following: Weapon of the greater potentates of Bonny Village, an outside butcher's cleaver used to dismember human bodies in the making of the great jars stored in the jails. This is a brutal craft, and the caterpillar mask that are worn by the greater potentates is the one that is also worn by the Hornsent of Mikla's companions, seemingly indicating that this Revenger was once part of this cruel brotherhood. And so the potentates of Bonny Village would butcher those who need to fit inside the jars. However, dismembering bodies is only part of the process, and we learn more at the whipping shed that lies on the outskirts of this village. Here we find the Tooth Whip, which reads the following: Filthy and seething with disease, the teeth are embedded in the whip and dose the victim with deadly poison upon each strike. As the wounds ripen they grow inflamed and ooze pus. The flesh of the shamans was said to meld harmoniously with others. So there are two parts of the process that is required: dismembering of other victims, but then tenderizing the shamans with the whip, so that their flesh would become the sort of glue that would meld everyone together. It specifically mentions that shaman are the base material for these jars, that their flesh has special properties that allows them to meld with others when tenderized by the Tooth Whip. The dialogue of the ghost found here at the whipping shed confirms that the shamans were the race who were subjected to this brutal treatment, as he says, For pity's sake, your place is in the jar, nigh Sainthood itself awaits you within. For shamans like you, this is your lot. This dialogue tells us quite a bit. Firstly, it confirms that shamans are the main target of this jar process, or a constituent part at least. And clearly, they were seen as lesser than the Hornsent, with this whipping ghost essentially saying that the treatment they are getting right now is the best that they can hope for, that they are so low that they should be grateful for this treatment. Given all we have discussed, it shouldn't be too much of a surprise that the Hornsent treat the Shamans this way. They are clearly a different people with different beliefs, and thus are likely to be persecuted by the dogmatic Hornsent. On the forehead of the jars, we can even say they bear some kind of brand, perhaps branding them as a shaman, someone marked for this cruel fate. The Shamans themselves are very interesting, and suffice it to say I will be doing a full video on Marika and the Shamans. Later on, we find the village of the Shamans, bathed in the golden light of the incantation minor Erdtree, its placement and item description confirming that this is the original home of Queen Marika, and her people are these Shamans. No doubt, this is why this place is somewhat protected by the Black Keep now. Its entrance is sealed by a statue of Marika, and it's defended by 2 tree sentinels. The ravages of Messmer's crusade didn't reach here, and it's likely a holy place to those of the Erdtree. The term shaman usually relates to magic or religion, and given Marika's association with trees, and the fact that the grandmother figure of the village seems to have grown into a tree, we can assume that these are people of naturalistic magic, or belief. Ultimately, all that really matters is that their beliefs will have differed and contravened that of the Hornsent, and as such they will have been a target for persecution and the Inquisition. But what is the point in this jar punishment? Why do they do this? Well, I still maintain the suggestion that I put forward in my story summary video a few weeks ago, that these jars are meant to replicate the Crucible, by blending life together in a fairly gruesome homage. This is why I think it's near sainthood, because they are taking these heretics and reforming them in the image of the Crucible. That's just my take on this punishment. However, it's worth noting that there are other theories that are very interesting and worth exploring. For example, the Centered Tarnished, whose video I will link below, made a really interesting theory. The Centered Tarnished believes that these jars were a genuine attempt at creating a saint or a god, and that by melding all these bodies together, a god or divine being would emerge eventually. Centered Tarnished believes that Marika, as a god, was a success in this regard, a successful jar recipe, if you will, and that the horrific jar innards we face in the jar jails are just failed versions. And whilst I still lean towards the jars just being a punishment rather than a genuine attempt at creating divinity, I do absolutely love this theory, and so I would direct you to the Centered Tarnished original video, which again will be linked below. But now that we've discussed the dogma of the Hornsent in quite a lot of detail, as well as the various sub-religions and cults, I want to talk about another facet of their history, and that is their interactions with the outer gods. We have now seen countless examples of the Hornsent coming down heavy on different cults and beliefs. However, it does seem as though some sub-beliefs were allowed, and in this case I am referring to the Church of the Bud, which we can find at the far end of Raw. However, I do believe it was likely once attached to the same landmass that Ballarat now occupies, as we can see they are extremely close geographically, and I believe that this land was once connected to one another and it made up a part of the greater metropolis of Ballarat. Part of my reason for believing so is that the Church of the Bud is actually of Hornsent construction and not a remnant of the ancient civilization of Raw. We can tell this because of the pillars in the church that have Bud statues on top of them are the signature spiral columns of the Hornsent that we can find in Ballarat itself, leaving us in no doubt that this is a Hornsent building. Understanding that the Church of the Bud is a Hornsent institution allows us to make more sense of what we see in the story trailer, in the moment where we see a figure silhouetted by the flames of Messmer's crusade cradling a spear, an extremely unique spear that we then see in the hands of one of the game's bosses, Romina. And the description of the pole blade of the Bud reads the following: Weapon of Romina, Saint of the Bud. A scarlet glaive with a dangling bud-like blade. Once in the crumbling, burning church, Romina held the Bud in speechless silence. That Bud would become her blade. The moment being described here is what we witness in the story trailer, Romina cradling the blade as Ballarat and the Hornsent civilization is burned around her. And this means that the worship of the Bud was an accepted part of Hornsent society. As for what this religion was, is unclear, aside from the fact it wasn't always connected to the scarlet rot like it is now, as the scarlet bud item description reads the following. There was a time when these buds were not touched by the scarlet rot's blight, when they were the symbol of the small church deep in the ancient ruins of Ra. So in the time before they were touched by the scarlet rot, they were still representative of the buds of the church, and therefore this religion. Indeed, it seems like Romina manifested the scarlet rot after Messmer's crusade happened, as her remembrance reads the following. After the church was burned to the ground, Romina discovered a twisted divine element, which she weaved into the baleful scarlet rot. Perhaps then, the buds might find somewhere to gain purchase once more within the scorched remains. What is this divine element? Well, I do have a couple of ideas. The first, of course, being that it's simply an element of the outer god of rot, as similar language is used a couple of times in relation to this particular outer god, like in the hefty pot of rot and the map of the lake of rot, which reads the following. It is said the divine essence of an outer god is sealed away in this land. As such, I think that in her despair, she somehow connected with a part of this outer god of rot, and the scarlet rot manifested. As for what the Church of the Bud believed in prior to it becoming associated with the scarlet rot, we can but guess. But perhaps they did worship the outer god of rot in the form of a bud. It was their interpretation of this being. This could explain how Romina was able to manifest the scarlet rot. After all, she was in despair in a church that could have been dedicated to this outer god. We know that the Hornsent interpreted the Crucible in their own form, so perhaps they worshipped the outer god of rot in a different form as well. One need only look at the item icon for the Scarlet Aeonia incantation to see the clear similarities to this and the bud of the church. Additionally, Romina's remembrance tells us that the buds were able to gain purchase once more, as if the bud religion is based on a memory of the scarlet rot from long ago, as if it once held sway in these lands, giving birth to buds, and thus this religion. I do believe this is likely, as we know that the outer god of rot has had worshippers in the past, as is the case with the Old Lords of Rot, that's described by the Mushroom Crown, which reads the following. Long ago, great lords served the scarlet rot. Perhaps such fungal bodies served as their crowns. Ultimately, I believe that the Hornsent worshipped the outer god of rot in the form of a bud, and that when the church was burned down in the crusade, Romina managed to connect to this being and bring the scarlet rot into this realm. Perhaps the scarlet rot once flows in the ancient civilization of Ra in the past, and it's from them that the Hornsent first discovered the religion of the bud. After all, we know the ruins of Ra were of great interest to the Hornsent and that they studied it. The Sprite Stone item description reads the following. According to the records left by Hornsent scholars, there were also contrivances known as bond stones that could manipulate the moment that the sprite vanishes. So it seems as though this explains the presence of Hornsent ghosts throughout the Ra runes. These were scholars, and indeed they do use sprite stones against us in an offensive manner. In general though, it seems as though the runes of Ra just became an extension of Belorat's domain, hence the Church of the Bud, Bird Warriors, and the Lion Divine Beast Dancer that we can find in this area. Romina and the Church of the Bud does not seem to be the only isolated incident of the Hornsent interacting with an outer god, and there are a couple of other events in Hornsent history which I find very interesting. Firstly, we have the existence of the Blood Fiends to consider, a really cool design, and initially these appear to be an entirely different species, that clearly interact with the Formless Mother. We can see this from their visual design alone, given they are able to use similar blood boon incantations to the one that Moog uses. We get confirmation that these beings are able to directly commune with the Formless Mother via Blood Fiend's Sacred Spear, which reads the following. One of the most significant implements used in their blood rituals. Sacred Spears of Blood are the instruments of communion with an outer god. The Mother of Truth desires a wound. One of the Blood Fiend's main strongholds is Rivermouth Cave, a cavern clearly dedicated to the worship of the Formless Mother. There is an altar in this cave, and on the altar is sacred bloody flesh, the item description of which reads the following. Raw meat soaked with blood, a delicacy of the Blood Fiends. The blood is said to have fallen from the Formless Mother's wound. Never will it dry, never will it rot. This is pretty extraordinary. These blood fiends are not demigods like Mohg, and yet they seem to have such a strong primal connection to the Formless Mother that they have been able to retrieve her very flesh. It's clear that these beings have created their own ritual and ways of honouring the Formless Mother. For example, we just read that the bloody flesh is a sacred delicacy of the blood fiends, meaning they don't only worship this flesh of the Formless Mother, they eat it in an act of communion. Additionally, we have the blood fiend's arm, the item description of which suggests ritual sacrifice or dismemberment of their own people in honour of the Formless Mother. Additionally, we have the sanguine flower, the item description of which reads the following: a blood flower with meaty petals, material used for crafting items, grown by blood fiends in pools of blood. Perhaps even the fiends admire blood's beauty. So the blood fiends cultivate these blood flowers, and in a lot of ways it mirrors the sanguine faith of the Mohgwyn dynasty, given the importance of blood rose to the Mohgwyn dynasty, like the blood roses that we find at Rose Church in Liurnia. Ultimately, the blood fiends and Mohgwyn's dynasty are two parallel faiths that have developed independently, both communing and worshipping with the same being, having very similar practices. And I actually take this as further evidence that the Mother of Truth is not the same thing as the Blood Star. Here we have a completely isolated clan who discovered the Mother of Truth for themselves, independent of Mohg's dogma and beliefs, and yet despite this separation between the two religions, they more or less worship the Formless Mother and commune with her in the same way. There is an opportunity here that if the Blood Star and the Formless Mother were the same thing, that From Software could have integrated the practices of the Thorn Sorcerers with the Blood Fiend's worship of the Formless Mother, or drop any other hint that they were one and the same. Instead, we get everything that is in line with what we know as the Formless Mother and her worship, and no mention or indication that the Blood Fiends connect with the Blood Star at all. For a more in-depth discussion on the differences between these two, I would direct you towards my Blood Star lore video, as I feel it holds up very well, especially following the DLC. At first glance, you could easily mistake these beings as being their own race, but there is some lore that suggests that they may have been a Hornsent tribe themselves. The blood fiend hexer Ash reads the following: long ago, a subjugated tribe discovered a twisted deity amongst the ravages of war, and they were transformed into blood fiends. The Mother of Truth was their saviour. So this tells us that they were made into the blood fiends, and this explains their primal connection to the Formless Mother. There is another item that relates to this event, and it does mention fires, making me feel like the subjugation of this clan took place during Messmer's crusade. I refer to the Outer God heirloom found in Prospect Town, guarded by the blood fiends. This talisman reads the following: a talisman engraved with the lore of an Outer God. The clan, who lost everything in the Great Fires, peered upon the corpse of their ancestor, normally an act of sanctity, and saw in its shadow a twisted deity. The clan had suffered such torment that the horrible thing was taken as an object of worship. This does suggest that Messmer's crusade was responsible for their subjugation and despair, and in an event similar to Romina, they made contact with an Outer God, whilst worshipping at the altars of one of the withered ancestors. I do really like the parallel of circumstances between this clan and Romina. Both of them touch an Outer God in a moment of despair, and it shows that these Outer Gods are looking for any opportunity that they can exploit so that they can spread their influence in the mortal realm. And I suspect that another way in which an Outer God spread its influence was through the horrifying fly sickness, a malady that affected the Hornsent. We know that these man-flies were once Hornsent, thanks to the description of their ashes, which read the following: afflicted Hornsent eventually metamorphosized into a fly-like form. It was believed that the moment the transformation took place, they were relieved from their suffering. This disease was deadly, and those that were transformed were the unlucky ones, as those too weak to bear the sickness instead died, as is suggested by the description of the ailment talisman. But where did this sickness come from? Well, I believe it's suggested this is a fungal infection, as the manflies drop the fly mold, a fungal product that is created from the innards of these creatures. Being fungal related, one may initially assume that this is a malady of the outer god of rot, spreading disease to increase its influence. Additionally, some of the rot flies are poisoned, they exist in a poison swamp, and overall they just fit the themes of decay and rot that we often associate with the outer god of rot. However, if we look a little closer, I do think this is likely the work of the Formless Mother. Accompanying the man-flies, there are sometimes just Hornsent spirits around them, and these cast swarm of flies, and this is an incantation that is directly associated with the Formless Mother. Why is it specifically these Hornsent that are associated with the man-flies that are casting these incantations? Well, flies are actually associated with the Formless Mother. For example, we can find the blood-tainted excrement in the blood swamps around Mohgwyn Palace, and the Swarm of Flies incantation actually reads the following. The new palace of the Lord of Blood lies in a swamp of festering blood, and these flies are said to spawn from the excrement of that land. So I do lean towards this being a disease of the Formless Mother's making. There is also a conspiratorial aspect to this. I think that the ailment talisman is actually suggesting that this disease was spread by those who were caring for those who fell ill, as it reads the following. Oddly, those who cared for the infected made certain they were given a proper burial were never afflicted themselves. What if these carers are actually the Hornsent spirits that cast the swarm of flies? And this is why they remain close to the man-flies, because they once quote-unquote cared for them. But the fact that they can use this incantation to me suggests that these are actually agents or cultists of the Formless Mother, and that they spread this disease in her name. It's just a theory, but let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I do think it fitting that the Mother of Truth has a strong connection with the Hornsent, manifesting in two separate tribes, the Blood Fiends and the Man-Flies, because in the base game we know that she gained a foothold thanks to the Omen Lord Mohg. Mohg's blood was the medium through which she first communed with him, and now it is Mohg's blood through which the dynasty is connected. We know that everyone who is inducted as part of Mohgwyn dynasty has Mohg's blood injected within them, and this is why the Sanguine nobles have Omen horns, as do the Albinaurics of Mohgwyn Palace. It's again a way to spread this corrupted and potent blood, and thus spread the influence of the Formless Mother. Omen blood is more potent and concentrated than normal blood, a theme that was also explored in Bloodborne, in which another formless god, Erdtree, also found it easier to commune with those of corrupted, vile blood. Thus, if the Hornsent are similar in physiology to the Omen, perhaps it isn't a surprise that the Formless Mother is so capable of communicating with them. Not only this, but in the case of both the Blood Fiends and the Man-Flies, she's actually manipulating their physical form, really reinforcing the potent connection she has with these beings. I now want to discuss the legacy of the Hornsent to the greater lore and to the history of the lands between. I'm not going to talk much about Messmer's crusade, as I've covered that really thoroughly in both my last two videos, and I just don't want to repeat myself once again, but let's touch on some timeline aspects. As I theorised in my Messmer lore video, I believe the Hornsent civilization was not wiped out by Messmer until much later on in the period of Erdtree rule, and that for a time they were allowed to exist under Marika's rule. As such, the Hornsent were allowed to carry on some of their practices for a time. For example, we have the item Festive Grease, which reads the following. The delightful festival is an old tradition, one old enough for the Erdtree to tacitly tolerate its endurance. This implies that this particular Hornsent celebration was allowed to survive under the rule of the Erdtree. Additionally, there are further examples of a sort of cultural overlap or osmosis between Leyndell and Belurat. For example, there is the Dueling Shield, which reads the following. An armament once used in ritual combat performed to honour the Erdtree, a custom that has somehow remained within the realm of Shadow. This is of course a reference to the gladiatorial fights of the Erdtree arenas that were meant to honour the Erdtree. and somehow it made its way to the lands of the Hornsent, and this highlights how close the two cities must have been at some stage in Marika's early rule. Additionally, earlier we spoke of the jar practices of the Hornsent, and of course we have to recognise the fact that the Erdtree rule has their own jar warriors, their own jar system. The process here under Leyndell is of course very different, with Alexander being a good example for us to observe. These jars seem to collect dead warriors, and do it with some reverence and respect. People are not punished and put inside these jars. These jars are a sort of collection service for fallen warriors. Ultimately, the jars seem to be a delivery service, bringing the corpses of the fallen to the roots of the minor Erdtrees, perhaps to be absorbed, and thus the jars have a more positive role in the Erdtree system of life and death, assisting Erdtree burial. Clearly Marika took the jar practices of the Hornsent, a practice which she knew all too well, and repurposed it for her own faction. Zuli the Witch actually just did a video on the jar innards, which I highly recommend and again will link below, and Zuli ended on a rather poignant note, reflecting on the fact that this might be Marika's attempt to honour her people, repurposing the process which was used to oppress her people, the Shamans. These are just a few examples of the cultural overlap between Leyndell and Belorat, showing that Marika's Leyndell society ultimately evolved alongside Belorat, at least for a time, and thus it's no surprise that the Hornsent who remain resent Marika greatly. They probably existed peacefully under her rule.
The Erdtree is my people's enemy, by Marika long betrayed, set aflame.
We also have to talk about the original sin that is mentioned in Messmer's remembrance, as I believe this has a lot to do with the Hornsent. To me, the original sin has to be a reference to Marika ascending to godhood, her original sin at the beginning of this new movement and religion. The story trailer shows and refers to this moment, and it refers to it as a seduction and a betrayal that led to her creating Shadow and Gold, usurping what other power structure the Hornsent had previously. As we discussed earlier, I do believe the Hornsent must have had their own god. They are the original owners and creator of the Gate of Divinity, and of course they must have had their own god as a result. In the trailer we see Marika pull some golden threads from a corpse, but what is this corpse, or who is it? For me it can be little doubt that this is the Hornsent divinity. We have no mention of this god anywhere else, and to me it makes sense that Marika would erase this part of her history. I believe she somehow got close to this god, seducing them with politics or in a more literal sense, and then murdered them, taking their golden power and using it to forge her own order and become her own god. I believe that Marika wishes to bury this part of her history for no other reason than she may suffer the same fate if it was discovered. Think about it, we know from Corrin that the Golden Order is founded on the principles that Marika is the one true god.
The Golden Order is founded on the principle that Marika is the one true god.
So how would people react to know that godhood isn't something necessarily truly divine, rather it is a power that can be claimed? If this truth became known, then people would realise that Marika isn't a true god given divine right. She is just the most powerful being of this age who claimed power for herself. Marika controls these lands through religion and dogma. This makes people obedient. And if this illusion was shattered, new people would try to seize power from her, as Mikola does himself when he too discovers the truth of her origins. As I mentioned in my story summary video, I do believe that the Nox, beings who are close to Marika in lineage, did know how she became a god, or at least had some understanding of it. And this is why we find the petrified bodies all throughout Noxtella. These petrified bodies are very similar to the ones that are found in Einir Elim, and it to me indicates that they were trying to replicate this process and create their own divinity. And so Marika uses her son Messmer to destroy the Hornsent and seal away their secrets.
Our lands were by thy kind set aflame, our tower by thy kind veiled in shadow.
Before sealing Messmer himself in the lands of Shadow, bearing the truth of her origin and raising herself up as the one true divine god, and in time people would forget about the Hornsent, burned and obliterated, and would only be remembered by a few. It is truly a forgotten piece of history, and as far as most modern people are aware, Marika is just the one true god. The one true god who built her empire upon the Hornsent who came before her. So thanks guys, that is my take on the Hornsent and their culture. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments below, whether you disagree with me, agree with me, or if you think I missed anything. Remember that if you like Elden Ring lore, then please like this video and consider subscribing to the channel, as both help the channel out immensely. Let me know what you'd like me to cover next, and until next time I will see you in the shadow of Belorat. Take care and have a wonderful evening.